Just 2 years ago, Ice Spice looked unstoppable. Everywhere you looked, she was there. TikTok, Instagram, Spotify playlist, YouTube shorts, she was there. She had hit songs, massive collaborations, millions of monthly listeners, and a large part of the internet was just obsessed with her. At first, it looked like she was going to keep getting bigger and bigger, but fast forward to 2026, and the hype is pretty much gone. Sure, she's still famous, people still know who she is, but she's nowhere near how she was at her peak. So what happened? How did one of the biggest breakout stars of the decade lose so much momentum in such a short amount of time? Well, after looking back at her rise and everything that happened afterwards, I think the answer is actually pretty simple. Ice Spice was the perfect artist for a specific moment in the internet. The problem is that once that moment passed, there wasn't much left. Let's start with how she blew up.
Stop playing with them, Ryan. You thought I was feeling you?
When Munch dropped in 2022, it absolutely exploded. Not because it was some lyrical masterpiece, because spoiler alert, it wasn't. It was just catchy. And it wasn't because it's reinvented rap in any way, but because it was a catchy song, simply put. It was memeable. It was, most importantly, different enough to stand out at the time. At the time, people hadn't really seen an artist like Ice Spice before. She had a recognizable look, a recognizable personality, and a recognizable sound. Every time she dropped something, it was being reacted to by popular streamers and YouTubers. Everything about her was easy to clip, repost, react to, and turn into a meme. And in the TikTok era, that is a superpower. People weren't just listening to Ice Spice, they were talking about her, they were making edits of her, they were posting clips of her interviews, they were reacting to her music. Even people who didn't even listen to rap knew who she was. That's when you know someone has become bigger than their music. But I think that's also where the problem started from. Because if we're being honest, a huge amount of Ice Spice's appeal had very little to do with the actual music and more to do with something else. A lot of people were more interested in her image than her songs. Her look, her aesthetic, what she represented. I mean, there's no secret that female rappers a lot of the time built their whole brand around sex. Because let's face it, sex sells, and Ice Spice was no different. From how she dressed to her twerking at every opportunity she got, this was all intentional branding. None of it happened by accident. The music almost felt secondary at times, and that's not necessarily her fault. The internet does this all the time. It turns people into these characters. When you blow up doing something people like, it's often really hard to do something else because you don't want to lose all that traction you gain from doing what they love. But eventually people stop caring about the character and they start paying attention to the actual body of work. In this case, people start paying more attention to the music. And that's where Ice Spice started running into trouble, because once the novelty wore off, people started asking a simple question: what else does she have to offer aside from the twerking and the shitty lyrics? Because literally, this girl loves singing about pooping and ass.
Think you the shit, bitch? You not even the fault.
Like, bruh, one of the biggest critique Ice Spice has faced throughout her career is that her music sounds repetitive. And honestly, I understand why people say that. A lot of her songs cover the same themes, they have the same lyrics, the same delivery, the same energy, the same overall formula. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a signature style. I mean, a lot of artists have signature styles. The problem is when the signature style becomes the entire act. At some point, people want growth. They want to see the artist grow. They want evolution. They want to hear something they haven't heard 10 times before. But with Ice Spice, it's often felt like she kept returning to the exact same formula that made her famous. And eventually people just got bored. And I mean, it did work for a while. The problem is that she never really expanded beyond it. Meanwhile, the internet was already moving on. And that's another thing people don't talk about enough. The internet is ruthless, especially on TikTok. One week you're the hottest person on earth. The next week, everyone's talking about somebody else. Attention spans are shorter than they have ever been. Trends move faster than ever, and staying relevant is harder than it has ever been. Blowing up isn't even the issue at this point. The question is, can you maintain it? That's why we have a lot of one-hit wonders nowadays. The artists who do survive, they usually adapt. They reinvent themselves several times, not just once, not just twice. They are constantly growing, constantly reinventing themselves, and they take a lot of risks. But when your entire career is built around one specific formula, adaptation becomes really, really difficult, because the very thing that made made people notice you is now the thing that is holding you back. And I think that's exactly what happened with Ice Spice. The version of Ice Spice that blew up was exciting. She was fresh. She was different. The problem is that 2 years later, it felt like we were still getting the same version of Ice Spice when she blew up. And once people felt like they had already seen everything she had to offer, the hype started disappearing. Now, to be fair, I don't think Ice Spice is some untalented failure. I mean, you don't get to the heights of fame that she got to by accident. But I do think people massively overestimate how sustainable her success was. At her peak, people talked about her like she was going to be the next big thing, especially since she got big name collabs like Nicki Minaj earlier on in her career. Looking back, I think a lot of the hype came from the internet being obsessed with the moment rather than the artist herself. People loved the memes, they loved the clips, they loved the aesthetic, they loved the conversations, they loved the twerking, if we're being honest. But once all that cooled down, the music alone wasn't enough to keep the same level of attention. And that's why I think Ice Spice lost momentum. Not because of one controversy. I know she had a thing with Nicki, but that's not what I'm talking about. That wasn't the only problem. It wasn't because one of her songs was bad either. And it wasn't because everybody suddenly hated her. No, it was because the formula that made her famous eventually stopped working. And when that happened, she wasn't ready. She was still the same girl who blew up. She didn't change nothing. Well, that's just my opinion. Do you think Ice Spice actually fell off? Or do you think people expected way too much from her in the first place? Let me know in the comments.